It's
Thank
good to
you.
be back with you, and I do appreciate the invitation to share this series with Mike. And I remember how to get back to that website by the little saying that Mike gave us last week, Mike Gone Wild. All right, so baml.org/Mike Gone Wild. That's the easy way for me to remember it, and it is oh so true as well. So we're grateful for the
Use that
opportunity
repeatedly.
to be
Careful,
here.
or I'm going to start unmuting myself here.
Well, yeah, that would ruin a lot of things. No, I'm kidding. But seriously, it is a pleasure to be with you. And 1 Corinthians 11 is a very difficult text. In fact, some scholars call it the most obscure and riddled with problem text in the New Testament itself. So we're not really going to try to solve all the problems here. I think we want to focus on, okay, what's really relevant to the discussion that we're having about the participation, the audible, visible participation of women in the assembly. And so I'm going to share my screen, and if I can get this going here. Here we go. All right. Do we have a visible? Are we visible?
John Mark, you
See the
are.
screen. Okay.
You are.
All right. Good. When in my journey, in thinking about this topic from writing a book in 1978 to 1990, I was asked by a university to give a presentation on their lectureship on 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Corinthians 14. Apparently, some people had read my book, and I'd also published an article in Image magazine along that line, stating kind of the traditional view I held at the time, that Paul is silencing all authoritative speaking, and that when Paul is talking about praying and prophesying in chapter 11, he's really not affirming that. So I had a kind of a way of understanding it that maintained a traditional view of the silence of women in the assembly, except for singing and confession at baptism. And when I wrote the article for Image, I had some doubts. I had some misgivings, some things I wasn't sure about, but I went ahead and wrote the article as I understood it at the time. But when they asked me to do this lectureship, I thought, I can't go with these doubts. I got to go and I got to do this again. I got to go back to the text, read up on the literature, study it again, find, confirm or move beyond what I was hoping to be very open-ended about it. That was my hope, that I wouldn't be closed-minded or I wouldn't be myopic in trying to prove a point I already believed, but that I would be open to what the text was actually going to do to me and how it was going to shape me. And it changed my mind. In 1990, through that summer of study, I changed my mind. I decided that, wait a minute, 1 Corinthians 11 really is not denying women the privilege of participating audibly in the assembly, but is actually authorizing women, gives women the authority to pray and prophesy in the assembly. And that's kind of what I want to walk through with you. Something of how that happened for me, and in so doing, walking through the text as well. One of the first notions that I had here that this was something other than what I thought was a book that I read. I must have encountered it in the early 1980s. This was not a book in my dad's library, so I didn't have access to it when I was a teenager. But it was a book by C.R. Nickel called God's Woman. C.R. Nickel he was born in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, but he lived in Texas most of his life. Actually, Abilene University gave him an honorary degree. but he was a very conservative minister. In fact, he's probably most well known for his series of books with R.L. Whiteside called Sound Doctrine, 5 volumes on sound doctrine. And maybe if those of you who have a history in Churches of Christ can kind of have a gut feeling about the phrase itself, right? But conservative, non-institutional, that is, he opposed churches sponsoring children's homes and any other parachurch organization with treasury money. So he was a widely respected, heralded leader among Churches of Christ, especially in Texas. But I read the book God's a Woman, and when I picked it up, I thought, this is going to be like I expect. I mean, I expect this to be a very traditional understanding, very traditional view. But if you're reading ahead on the slide here, you know it's not a traditional view. In fact, he actually argues that 1 Corinthians 11 authorizes women to pray and prophesy in the assembly, and that the purpose of prophesying was to edify, and that women in the assembly, the same assembly where the Lord's Supper is taken, that assembly, women prophesied. And they were understood, and therefore they were edifying. And it just blew my mind. Whoa, wait a minute. How can this traditional church guy say something like that? Well, I came to learn over the long haul that from 1888 to 1938, there was roughly kind of a 50-year discussion of trying to figure out the participation of women. And there were hardcore, total silence on one end in the public assembly. There were others who were saying, no, women can lead prayer, they can exhort, they can testify. And C.R. Nickel was one of those. And his book is here kind of the last gasp, you might say, among Churches of Christ for the participation of women in the assembly. You could even suggest that C.R. Nickel was trying to roll back the tide here in this book, but it wasn't effective. It didn't roll back the tide. And so by the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, women were totally excluded from a public voice in the assembly, except for singing and the confession of faith at baptism. But when you look at what C.R. Nickel is dealing with here, 1 Corinthians 11, verses 4 and 6, says kind of matter-of-factly, any man or husband, that's a debate, who is he talking about? Any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head disgraces his head. But any woman, wife, who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled or uncovered disgraces her head. It is one and the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman will not veil or cover herself, then she should cut off her hair. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or to be shaved, she should wear a veil or a covering. And C.R. Nickel understood this verse to just simply state as a matter of fact a reality that was happening in the church of Corinth that was corrected, not in terms of, okay, you got to stop those women praying and prophesying, but was corrected by saying, okay, we need to have a covering, whatever the problem was. And this verse raises all kinds of questions. Okay, what are we talking about when we're talking about the covering? Who are we talking about? We talking about husbands and wives, or we talk about men and women in general? What does the covering mean? How does it relate to, why the distinction between men and women in terms of the covering itself? What's going on with that? And why implement it here? Or is this something that happens in all churches or just in Corinth? Is there something unique to Corinth's situation, or was this true in Ephesus as well? Even though in Ephesus, the problem there was hairstyle, not covering, which may tell us Okay, in Ephesus, Paul didn't say the solution was cover yourself. No, the solution was pay attention to your hairstyle, which means that was visible in Ephesus. But here in Corinth, it's something else is going on. So we got all kinds of questions related to this text. What is the head covering? Is it something that just covers the face, but seems to be it covers the hair? Or maybe it's the hair itself. And what does it mean? What does it signify? Is it about authority? Is it about modesty? Is it about sexuality? And what is happening in the assembly that Paul says, okay, I need to talk about this. What is it that in the culture and the relationship of the church to the culture that generates this question or generates the problem? And then there's all kinds of questions about the meaning of words and the metaphors that are used and how are they being applied here? Why does he appeal to Genesis 2? How does verses 11 and balance with verses 7 to 9? What does it mean to say because of the angels? And what is the meaning of that word authority and its use there in verse 10? Just all kinds of problematic questions. And at the root of some of those problems is that we're not sure what the problem was. You know, we don't know what generated Paul's response. You probably heard that illustration about listening to one side of the telephone conversation. I mean, we've all done that, right? Where we're listening to our spouse talk on the phone and we're getting all kinds of curiosity about what are they talking about? Why did she say that? Or why did he say that? And so when they get off the phone, we get to ask them, unless you get told, well, that was private, you know, but you get to ask them, what did he say? What was the problem? We don't get to do that with Paul. All we have is what we got. So we have to somehow imagine as best we can, given what we know about the culture, about the situation in Corinth and what happens in the rest of the letter, or in Paul's life with Corinth overall, we have to imagine what the problem is in some way. And any imagination of the problem is going to be relative. It's going to be educated guesswork because we really don't know. We don't know what the person said on the other end of the telephone. All we know is what Paul said in response to their question. And so is the problem with men? And some would suggest that, yeah, that's the problem. Men are praying covered, and Paul wants them to pray uncovered. Because the Roman practice was for both men and women to be covered when they are involved in liturgy rituals at the temple. With the Roman practice, there's a lot of evidence for that men and women, when they led in the procession or when they were participating in the temple cult, they covered themselves, both men and doing is he's saying, women, you keep the practice, but men, you uncover yourself. And that becomes the problem. Or is the problem with women that that instead of covering themselves, are y'all still hearing me? I'm getting a connection problem.
Yeah,
They were
a
covered
little bit, but we're good.
They were uncovered. Right. They were uncovering themselves to participate. Well, is that what they were doing? That's a pretty common one. Okay, Paul's problem was with the women because they kept uncovering themselves to pray and prophesy, and Paul didn't want them to be uncovered. Some suggest, this one seems more likely to me, but again, we're just educated guessing, that there were men who insisted that women be uncovered, and that part of the cultural practice was that married women would be covered in the public sphere, and unmarried women and women under age, etc., or even women of disrepute would be uncovered. And so some men were saying, no, everybody needs to be uncovered when they're praying and prophesying. And that Paul's response is, no, we need to continue the public demeanor, public practice. We need to continue the cultural conventions, and women need to be covered when they are praying and prophesying. And then some suggest that, really we have a problem of men forbidding women from prophesying at all. And that's another possibility, that Paul had opponents in Corinth that didn't like women praying and prophesying in the assembly. So the kind of the upshot of that is, wow, there are a lot of possibilities here. And we may not know exactly why Paul says what he says or the occasion upon which he says, but he says what he says. I think we're going to get to that point in just a moment. We are so distant from the situation that we don't really know with any precision. What Paul does seem to do is say men should be uncovered and women should be covered. And so the question becomes, well, why should the women be covered and the men not? And some suggest, well, that's because men have the authority. They're the head. And so since they have the authority, women should symbolize that authority by wearing a covering. And that's rooted in some kind of hierarchy based on creation. The problem with that, it seems to me, is the only time the word authority is used in 1 Corinthians 11, it's about the woman's authority. And we'll get to that in just a moment. And there's no suggestion that this is about submission. Women are submitting to men. Unless you read that into the word head. And we'll talk about that in a moment as well. I actually think it's more likely that the covering has to do with sexual propriety or modesty within the Greco-Roman world and the Jewish world as well. That uncovered women, when you have your hair uncovered and it's loose and it's free, it sends in that culture, it sends a sexual message. It sends a message of availability. And it's particularly why married women practice the covering across the culture, because they didn't want to send that signal of sexual availability. Unmarried women and women engaged in reputable practices, okay, it didn't matter then, they were available. So I think when Paul says it is fitting that women should pray covered, I think it has more to do with sexual modesty than it does with authority or male authority. But we're going to dig into that a little bit more in just a second. What I'm really interested in, though, is that Paul's statement. What Nichols referred to and said, look, it's what Paul says. Paul just plain says that I want women to pray, women pray and prophesy in this context that he's talking about. And when we hear the words praying and prophesying, it seems to me we have to hear that in the language of 1 Corinthians itself. It's the same language that we had in chapter 14, where people pray in tongues. They pray in the assembly, and that this is a way to edify the assembly when those tongues are interpreted. But they also prophesy in the assembly. And that's a way to edify the assembly. It's a way to encourage it, to build it up, to give it comfort. It's a way of forming people in the assembly in ways that they learn something. Remember that statement there in verse 31, that all can prophesy one by one, so that all may learn. They're going to be taught something. They're going to learn something from the way people prophesy or from what they prophesy. And if Paul uses that language in chapter 14, and he uses the same language in chapter 11, and they're both talking about an assembly, it seems to me that should give us an idea of what's going on here. This is not some inaudible silent prayer, nor is it a silent prophesying. It is rather an edifying act in the midst of the assembly. That all may learn and be encouraged by those who pray and prophesy. And the fact that women are prophesying should not be a surprise to us. In fact, 2 of the first 5 named prophets in the Hebrew Bible are women. Miriam and Deborah, 2 of the first 5. You know who the other 3 were? It was Moses and Aaron and, oh, who's the other one? Boy, I've lost that one all of a sudden. Maybe it's Samuel that came up. But the 2 of the first 5 are women. Miriam is one who is a leader in Israel. In fact, in Micah chapter 6 and verse 4, we're told that it was Moses, Aaron, and Miriam that God sent them to lead Israel out of Egypt and to lead Israel through the wilderness as well. And Miriam, you probably know the story in Exodus 15, verse 20, when she takes the tambourine in her hand and the women follow her with the tambourines and with dancing. And it says Miriam sang to them. Now, a lot of times people hear the them and they think, oh, she sang to the women. Well, no. The word them in Hebrew is masculine in gender, which I think includes men and women because of the generic masculinity there. So she is not just singing to the women. She's not just leading the women. She's also leading the men. And she tells the men, sing. She commands the men to sing to the Lord. I think it's kind of the first worship leader of Israel is a woman who leads the assembly of Israel coming up out of the sea and leads the assembly of Israel in the praise of God. I think that's a pretty fascinating thing. And she is a prophet, one to whom the Lord gives visions and dreams. Deborah is a prophet as well. In fact, Deborah and Samuel, the only 2 named prophets and judges who are both prophets and judges. Only Deborah and Samuel fit that category. That's pretty good company. And she is a leader in that she makes judgments. She makes decisions. And as a prophet can speak into that. Huldah is a prophet who declares the word of the Lord to the high priest and the royal envoys. Then we come to Anna in Luke chapter, where she has been living in the temple, walking around the temple as a prophet. Now, what is a prophet doing in the temple courts? Well, she is prophesying. She's teaching. She's communicating the word of the Lord to the people. And when she discovers who Jesus is, the Messiah of Israel, she goes around telling everybody, to all, it says, and all is masculine. That includes men. In the temple courts, in the place where Israel assembles to worship, where it assembles to hear teaching. The temple courts is exactly where the priests taught. And she is a prophet telling the story of God to all who are looking for redemption. And in Acts 2, it shouldn't surprise us that there are women prophets, because in Acts 2, women received the gift of the Spirit. I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, and your sons, that should be sons there, sons and daughters shall prophesy, even upon my slaves, both men and women. In those days I will pour out my Spirit. They shall prophesy. And we see it coming to fruition in Acts with Philip's daughters. So this is not some kind of obscure theme in the biblical story. These are primary leaders, Miriam and Deborah, and then the prophecy of Joel to pour out the Spirit upon the sons and daughters of Israel so that they will see dreams and visions and prophesy. When you put it in the context of Joel and the pouring out of the Spirit upon the church and the renewal of Israel, it's not a secondary theme. It's not a marginal theme. It is, in fact, the very heart of God's movement toward new creation that is announced on the day of Pentecost. And therefore, I think it's something we need to pay significant attention to. So when we come to 1 Corinthians, we see women prophesying, that shouldn't shock us. It shouldn't say, oh, wow, that's weird. Well, no, this is exactly what Joel promised and what Peter confirmed. And now Corinth is practicing. Now, one of the ways in which this kind of is relativized by some, I think unfortunately so, is that somehow prophets are just kind of, especially the women prophets, are just kind of, they're just given personal testimonies out of their experience of God. And that it really has no authoritative function in the church. It doesn't really, it's marginal in the church. And the real important people in the church are the teachers, or we might say preachers or elders. And so prophets get kind of put on the back burner in some way, or made secondary in some way. But I want you to hear the word of the Lord here. I want you to hear Paul in Ephesians 4 when he says, you know, when Christ ascended, he gave gifts. Some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers. Now, I don't know that Paul is giving a hierarchy here of some kind, or maybe a succession of temporal realities. I don't know. But the company he's keeping is pretty good. To say apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, to put the prophets in that category, we wouldn't say, for example, that pastors or even preachers have more weight than apostles. Whatever we say about the weighting of it, these are all grouped together. There's something about what they're doing in terms of leading the church and teaching the church and guiding the church and helping to grow the church into the measure of Christ, to equip the church for the ministry of the saints. Prophets are a part of that. The prophets have some kind of authoritative function, if we want to use the word authority in this context. Or 1 Corinthians 12, verse 28, here it's even set out more like, well, first, apostles. Second, preachers. No, it didn't say preachers, right? It said prophets. Third, teachers. There's, I don't know exactly what to make of that for Paul, but at the very least, it would be sort of strange to say men can prophesy, but they can't teach. Well, wait a minute. First apostles, second prophets, then teachers. Our women can prophesy, but they can't teach. Would Paul have said that in 1 Corinthians? When in fact, in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 26, he said, let each one bring a hymn and a teaching and a revelation. In other words, you can pray and you can prophesy, but you can also teach. You can bring a lesson as well. My point here is to say that when we think about prophets in the early church, we're thinking about something that is more analogous to what we call preachers. That that's what they do. They deliver the word of the Lord. And I don't think Paul in Corinthians is going to make some kind of, okay, women can prophesy, but they can't teach. In fact, if they can prophesy, they can teach, because prophesy seems to carry more weight for Paul than just teaching, for whatever reason, which we don't really need to explore. But even if we come to the function of prophecy, which Paul tells us explicitly what the function of prophecy is, it's for upbuilding, encouragement, and consolation. It's a word of exhortation. The book of Hebrews, which is probably just a long sermon in one form or another, calls itself a word of exhortation. That was the way to talk about sermonizing in the first century. It's what you did at the synagogue. When Paul went to the synagogue, they asked him, hey, do you have a word of exhortation? You know, do you have something you want to say? You want to preach? It seems to me when we are talking about functional equivalency, in terms of what happens in an assembly and the authority that is typically given to certain functions in the assembly, I think it's quite a stretch to say that prophesying doesn't equate in some form with preaching. That what was called prophesying in Corinth has a kind of equivalency with preaching in our context. At the very least, it seems to me prophesying carries a lot of authority with it. As Huldah went, as Huldah told the high priest, thus says the Lord, this is the word of the Lord for you. When Miriam prophesied, did people have to obey? When Deborah said, this is the decision, did they have to submit to that? And if we suggest, well, that the submission there is not really submission because, well, wait a minute, let's think about it. If people had to submit to the decisions of Deborah, if people had to obey the prophesying of Miriam, if the high priest and the king had to obey the prophesying of Huldah, and they had to submit to that, then we say, well, no, it's not supposed to work that way. It did work that way. And it tells us that when God created the world, God did not create the world in such a way that Deborah couldn't be Deborah, and Miriam couldn't be Miriam, and Huldah couldn't be Huldah. Maybe we need to hear more, as C.R. Nichols said, let's just let this word of God stand where it stands. Men and women prophesy. Now, I think that's the important takeaway here from 1 Corinthians 11. In this text, God does not give men and women different roles. We've often heard that kind of, okay, women and men are equal, but they have different roles. In this text, in the assembly, with the giftedness of praying, maybe praying in tongues, and prophesying, Paul does not give men and women different roles. And he doesn't assign them different gifts. They both pray and prophesy. What is different is a different dress, a different appearance. And that's when we have to ask the question, well, why the different appearance? Is the different appearance rooted in creation that, well, God created women and they should always be covered? Is that the conclusion? It's not our practice now, is it? We don't ask for women to be covered in the assembly. Maybe the dress has to do not so much with the theology of creation or the theology of men and women, but has to do with the cultural conventions that are operative in the place of Corinth. Maybe there were certain cultural signals and receptors that Paul says, women need to be covered. And that is very different from saying women need to have a different gift or different role. In fact, I think what Paul is describing here is something that he commends. That, as in verse 2, he says, I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions of the assembly, I think specifically is what he's talking about. Just as I handed them over to you. I like what you're doing. You have men and women praying and prophesying. You have men praying uncovered and women praying covered. Hey, good. I commend that. That's a good thing. When it comes to the Lord's Supper, though, I need to talk to you about that. That's not what I intended. So he's commending the practice from the very get-go. And verse 16, that's a tough one. I mean, verse 16 is tough to understand because we don't know what the custom is that he's referring to here. Is he talking about the practice of uncovered and covered? Or is he talking about the practice of being contentious? Either way, this is something that has to do with assemblies, because the assemblies of the church are part of the rationale, even though it's not really clear to me exactly what Paul is thinking about there. But here what we come to. If women are praying and prophesying with covered heads, Where are they doing it? See, one of the ways some have suggested that we should understand this is to say, well, this must be something different than the Sunday morning assembly. This must be something different than when the whole church is gathered. Well, okay, let's think about that for a moment. Because and why would you think there's something different between 11 and 14? Well, because you've already decided 14 means silent. So what's happening in 11 can't be happening in 14. Well, that depends on a certain way of understanding 14. If you think 14 is about disorderly speaking and not about silence of prophesying, then there's no problem here. If the disorderly speaking is different from prophesying, Paul can say, stop your disorderly speaking, and at the same time, encourage all to prophesy, which is exactly what Paul said in chapter 14, and what is happening in chapter 11. Men and women are gathered together. Otherwise, there's no need for covering at all. It's a public gathering, in the sense that the use of the covering reflects a certain public nature to this. It's not just simply a family gathered in a home where you don't need a covering. Or it's a gathering where people are edified and through praying and prophesying. And it's a gathering that follows some traditions that Paul commends them for following. And these traditions happened in the assembly when they were gathered. The assemblies of God. This is the way the assemblies of God do things, right? Whatever that custom refers to. This is how assemblies keep traditions. So it seems to me that what we have here is women praying and prophesying in the assemblies of the saints, without any distinctions about assemblies, like, oh, well, maybe this is a Bible class and not the assembly. Well, where's that in the text? That's kind of bringing our current practices on top of what's going on in 1 Corinthians 11. Instead of let 1 Corinthians 11 just say what it says in one sense. Women prayed and prophesied. And Paul commends that. He commends the way they're doing it. Uncovered for men, covered for women. So for me, this was the turning point for me. That I expanded my understanding of participation of women in the assembly, because it seems, as my dad would say, not necessarily about this, but as my dad would use the word, it's unget-aroundable that women are praying and prophesying in the assembly. But we do need to pay attention to a couple of things that are helpful to reinforce this point as part of Paul's argument. And wow, this is so complex and so detailed that, you know, our time together is not sufficient to plow through all the different sorts of things that are going on. Paul uses a headship principle in verse 3, but then he says in verse 11, nevertheless. In other words, there's some kind of contrast. There's some kind of, yeah, but don't take that too far kind of thing. Whatever he means by that in verse 3, in verse 11, he's telling us, be careful. Don't overplay that hand, all right? You have to remember that this is also true, that men are the head of women, or husbands are the head of wives. And at the same time, and even framing and shaping that, is our recognition that in the Lord, we are not independent of each other, and that women, though they came from men, now men come through women. But everything comes from God. We got to get back to God on this. And it's God who distributes the gifts in the community of faith, and not men who decide what gifts people have or what gifts women have. It's a complex argument, and it's very difficult in a lot of ways, and I don't have resolution to everything. But verse 3 is kind of a verse that people will take and say, oh, there it is. Men are the head of women, and that the men have the authority over women. And they have the authority over women because that's the way God created it. And you probably heard that statement, and I've actually argued for that statement in the past. But I don't think that's what the word head is about here. I don't think the word head is about authority, but I'll get to that in just a moment. In fact, there's a relationality. Yes, women came from men, and they were for men in the sense that they were to complete the humanity so that they could participate in the mission of God. Not that they were for men in the sense that they're the slaves of men, or even kind of junior partners with men. Rather, they were partners. They were helpers corresponding, as Genesis 2 says. Helpers alongside of, not beneath or above. And so there's a relationship there that is important. Understand that relationship as undermining the privilege and the authority of women to participate in praying and prophesying. Or let me put it another way. The word head, which some take to be authority, a sign of hierarchy, others think, and I'm in this category, I think of it this way myself, and the argument for it is going to be very detailed and cumbersome. And let me just put it this way. The idea of, when you say the word head in English, we immediately think of boss or president. When you said head in Greek, the immediate thought was relationship and source. The head of the body, the head is the source of life for the body. The head nourishes the body. And the Greeks thought that the head was where it all took place, right? That it was the source of life itself. And that may be what is going on here. It's not about authority as much as deep connection, deep relationship. In fact, such a deep relationship that women came from men, but now men come from women. And now it's a relationship that is interdependent and reflecting that the ultimate source of all things is God. But whatever we say about head, we can just kind of put that on the side for a moment. Because whatever we say about head, whatever its specific meaning is, Paul says, in fact, women may lead an assembly in prayer and prophecy without dishonoring their head. Did you catch that point? Whatever head means. We have an assembly where women are praying and prophesying without dishonoring their head. When they're covered, they are honoring her head, whether that means the male or whether that means her own dignity, which I take it as her own dignity myself. But whatever we mean by that, women can pray and prophesy in the assembly and still honor the relationship between the man and the woman. It is not an assumption of authority that subverts the relationship of men and women. In fact, in the Lord, it's a mutual relationship. But here comes the critical. Well, I wouldn't say it's a deciding thing. I would say it is a supporting point, because the deciding thing is men and women are praying and prophesying in the assembly, period. But here's a contributing point that I think was convicting to me as I studied this text. I have three translations there, and you notice they're different, right? The New RSV says a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, which assumes that the covering is a symbol of male authority. The NIV says a woman ought to have authority, not a symbol of authority, but to have authority over her own head. And then the King James says, back to 16:11, for this cause ought the woman to have power on her head. You notice the King James has this have power. They recognize that the authority is something that the woman has. The New RSV, along with a lot of modern translations, I think it's, they insert the word symbol. The word symbol is not in the Greek text. Rather, what the text says is to have authority. This is talking about what a woman possesses. The woman possesses authority. And it's Paul's normal word for authority. So there are ways of understanding this. What's the best way of understanding it? Well, you can see the translations differ, so it's probably not an easy point to make, but I think there is a substantial point to make. To have authority, this Greek phrase in 1 Corinthians is used 4 times other than chapter 11, verse 10. And the 4 times it's used, it always has this active sense of to have authority, not have a symbol of authority, but to have the actual authority. Do we not have the right to our food and drink? Do we not have the authority to our food and drink? Do we not have the right to be accompanied by a believing wife? Is it only Barnabas and I who have no right, authority, have authority? So Paul, every time he uses this phrase in 1 Corinthians, is always talking about something the person possesses. They have authority. This is not an authority of another. This is the authority of the person who is being covered, or the person who is praying or prophesying. They have authority over their head. And in fact, the only other time, I think this is a really important point. The only other time where Paul uses this word authority, exousia, in relation to men and women is back in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 4, where he talks about a mutual authority. The wife has authority over the husband's body, and the husband has authority over the wife's body. If they have authority in the most intimate act between a husband and wife, in the most vulnerable act between the husband and wife, and they have mutual authority, why would in the assembly of the church that mutuality disappear and some kind of hierarchy appear? Paul emphasized the mutuality. Whatever head means, Paul says, hey, we're still in the Lord, we're still interdependent. And you got to remember, you men come through women just as much as the woman came from you. To have authority is used in Revelation with the same preposition, to have authority upon or have authority over. You can see how it's always talking about over. So the conclusion I would come to is that Paul is saying a woman has authority over her own head. It's not male authority. It's not men telling women what to do or how women should behave. It's rather she has authority over her own head. And that means she has a right to cover herself as she pleases in order to maintain her dignity and modesty and propriety. And as Paul says, it is fitting for a woman to cover herself when she prays and prophesies. So it's an authority to cover her head and an authority as well to pray and prophesy. So that's why I titled this whole PowerPoint series as the authority. Women have the authority to pray and prophesy. Again, I've already mentioned what's on this slide, so you can pick it up for yourself and look at it later. But basically the point is, in the Lord, there is mutuality. In the Lord, women pray and prophesy. In the Lord, everything comes from God. And whatever headship means cannot undermine what is true in the Lord. So some conclusions. And I have no idea what time it is, but we're getting to the end. All right, so hang with me. 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16, Paul assumes women are praying and prophesying in the assembly. In fact, he commends it, right? Because of the traditions. He's, I commend, you're keeping some traditions and I commend you. And this is one of them that I commend you for. And this praying and prophesying is audible, it's public, it's visible, and it's edifying. And headship, whatever it means, does not deny women the privilege to pray and prophesy in the assembly. Women ought to honor their relationship with men because they came from men. And at the same time, men ought to honor their relationship with women because they came through women. It's pretty poignant for me today because January 24th is my mother's birthday, and we lost her back in October. So I have that just hits me. For some reason, it hit me right now, and I shared that with you. It's recognizing the honor we owe women because we come through them, and the honor that women owe men because they came from man. But it's a mutual honor, not a hierarchy of honor. It's a mutual authority. So consequently, women have the right, they have the authority, they have the exousia to pray and prophesy in the assembly, since they have authority over their own heads. It's an authority that lies within them, not something given by the males in the room. It's an authority that comes from God, not from men. So what does that mean for us today? This is my opinion. Nobody's told me to say this or not say this. I'm just giving you how I read it now and why I read it that way. Men and women, both Jew and Gentile, as well as enslaved and free, gathered for communal praise and mutual encouragement in Corinth. Women as well as men exercised their gifts in the assembly for the sake of the common good, including prayer and prophecy, but also hymns and teachings and tongues. Men and women both participated in this, and only the disorderliness was modified, right? In this circumstance, in this situation, be silent. But otherwise, everyone is encouraged to pray and prophesy. Everyone is encouraged to bring a hymn, a teaching, as long as they did so in orderly and modest ways. So I would take this to mean that women, that the assembly is a place where both men and women may exercise their gifts for the edification of the assembled people of God. Women may lead the assembly through prayer and prophesying, which I think is kind of the functional equivalent of preaching. It would be hard to say preaching is more authoritative than prophesying, it seems to me. I think that would be a conundrum. But even if we just say, well, they're sort of similar. If women prophesied, seems to me they can preach or teach the assembly is what we usually mean by preaching, teaching the assembly. And both men and women must do so in ways that honor their relationships, the relationships they sustain with each other and God, as well as participate in ways that pay attention to the cultural perceptions, whatever that head covering means. So if wearing a red hat meant that you were an immoral person in the culture, or a blue hat or a gray hat or whatever color, I'm not trying to be political, I just drew that out of my mind, okay? What if there was a particular color that said, whoever wears that color is immoral in the culture, and everybody in the culture understood that? Then we probably wouldn't want men or women leading the assembly wearing that color. About cultural propriety. And I think that's why we don't wear veils anymore. We don't wear head coverings anymore. Because we recognize it's not about what God created. It's about what human culture perceives. And we want to be modest and have propriety in relationship to modern culture. Two more slides. This is next to the last. I'm taking you back to C.R. Nickel again. This conservative right wing, about as right wing as you can get in most ways, looked at this text and said, well, women were prophesying in the church. It just says it. And the only reason to unsay it is because we can't make sense of chapter 14. But I think there's a way of making sense of chapter 14 that allows Paul to say what Paul said. And then lastly, this is my last slide. I want to call attention to how how this debate from 1888 to 1938 ended up. Here's F.W. Smith. F.W. Smith was a contributor to the Gospel Advocate for decades. He was a well-respected conservative leader. He was the minister for a long time at the Fourth Avenue Church in Franklin, Tennessee. Just one of the guardians of the faith, you might say. And he wrote this little article where he was asked a question about women praying in the assembly, which tells you some people are still doing that. And what F.W. Smith says here becomes the standard line. And actually, this viewpoint then shaped the practices of Churches of Christ. So by the 1940s and 1950s, women were no longer audibly participating in the assembly. Even though in African-American churches, they did in certain ways. But in the white churches, now, total silence, except for singing. Listen to what he says. I conclude, therefore, not dogmatically, but it did become dogmatic later on. But here, right now, in 1929, it's not dogmatic, but to be on the safe side. That since the word of God does not clearly and explicitly inform us that it would be scriptural for a woman to lead the prayer in the assembly of the saints. Well, what did 1 Corinthians verses 4 and 5 say, actually? Seems to me that's pretty clear and explicit, at least according to the normal meaning of those words. But he didn't see it because he made some kind of adjustments with 1 Corinthians 14 and relativized 1 Corinthians 11 and did some what I would regard as kind of hermeneutical gymnastics. But he does say he's not dogmatic about it. But we need to be safe. So it would be best to conform to the custom in this respect of the loyal churches. You hear two things? Besides the hermeneutics and understanding 1 Corinthians 11 verses 4 and 5, we hear two other things. One is to be safe. And the second is to be loyal. Loyal because the churches where women are participating, those are the churches that we can't trust. They're not among us. They're not among the Gospel Advocate crowd. That's the Apostolic Review crowd. That's different crowd. That's not us, Gospel Advocate loyal churches. And that sense of loyalty really fundamentally shaped Churches of Christ in the South. And also safe. Isn't it just safe to do what we do? Let's just stay safe. Why rock the boat? Why even think about this? Maybe because what Smith decided was safe was actually a denial of what Paul commended. I don't think it's too safe to deny what Paul commends. But in the 1930s, 1940s, Churches of Christ as a whole took up the safe call and the loyal call. And women were totally silenced. Now, there are some other reasons for that and other cultural factors in play, of course. And the history is too long for us to talk about here at the end. But what I want to suggest to you is, as you think about this text, 1 Corinthians 11, verses 4 and 5 particularly, as you listen to that text, don't listen with ears of what's safe or what's loyal. Let's listen as best we can with the difficulties of the text itself. Let's listen to what the text says and be formed by that. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate you being here, and I hope it's not 2:30 or something, because I have no clue.
No, it is not.
I'm
John
just
Mark,
starting out.
your inner clock is amazing. It is 2:04.
Oh, okay, very good.
That is, wow, good stuff. Man, we appreciate that. You know what? I just want to kind of remind everybody, John Mark's book here, I don't know if that shows up or not, Women Serving God, really kind of goes into a lot of the things that we don't have time to cover over the course of just an hour like that. And some of the history of our fellowship, I just found to be fascinating and amazing. And man, that was powerful, John Mark. I appreciate what you've been sharing with us. Do we have any, I know Karen had a question. I think Mike went ahead and addressed that with her. I don't know if there are any other questions that I have seen. I don't think I have missed any. Give it just a second to see if anybody has anything they want to pull up or not. Next week, it'll be what? 1 Timothy 2, correct?
That's correct. First Timothy.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay, well, listen, we will plan on